In the deep shadows of antiquity, long before the rise of Rome, before Athens crowned its hills with marble, before even the pyramids had fully claimed their place as symbols of eternity, there existed a civilization that reshaped the ancient world with unprecedented force. It conquered vast territories, unified diverse peoples under a single rule, standardized language and administration, and created the first true empire in human history. For a time, its power seemed unbreakable, its influence unavoidable. And yet, centuries later, it vanished so completely that even its name faded into silence, buried beneath sand, myth, and forgotten ruins. This was a civilization that taught the ancient world how to rule, how to conquer, and how to think in terms of empire rather than city-states. Its kings did not merely govern towns or regions. They ruled lands stretching from the mountains to the sea, from fertile river valleys to distant deserts. Messengers carried royal decrees across hundreds of miles. Armies marched in disciplined formations never before seen. A single language echoed across markets, temples, and courts, binding together peoples who had once been divided by dialect, custom, and loyalty. At the heart of the civilization lay a river-fed land, rich in soil and ambition, where earlier societies had already planted the seeds of urban life. But where others had remained fragmented, this people dared to unify. They believed power should flow from the center outward, enforced by strength, loyalty, and divine authority. Their rulers claimed the favor of the gods, presenting themselves not merely as kings, but as chosen instruments of cosmic order. To obey the ruler was to obey the heavens themselves. Their rise was sudden and astonishing. Within a single lifetime, scattered city-states were brought to heel. Fortified walls fell. Rival kings were defeated, executed, or forced into submission. Tribute flowed into the imperial heartland in the form of grain, metals, livestock, and labor. Artisans, scribes, and scholars were relocated across the empire, spreading knowledge and culture while reinforcing centralized control. Never before had the ancient world witnessed domination on such a scale. This civilization understood something revolutionary. Conquest alone was not enough. To dominate the ancient world, one had to manage it. Roads were established to speed communication. Administrative districts were created and governed by appointed officials loyal to the crown. Taxes were assessed systematically. Records were kept with meticulous care, pressed into clay tablets that detailed everything from grain rations to military campaigns. Bureaucracy, often seen as a modern invention, was born in this ancient empire. Language became one of its most powerful tools. While previous societies clung to local tongues, the civilization imposed a single official language across its domains. It became the language of trade, diplomacy, law, and literature. Even after the empire itself collapsed, this language endured for centuries, used by later civilizations who barely remembered its origin. In this way, the empire outlived itself, its voice whispering through history long after its political power was gone. Religion, too, was reshaped under imperial rule. Local gods were not destroyed but absorbed, woven into a larger divine hierarchy that mirrored the empire's political structure. The chief deity stood supreme, just as the emperor ruled above all kings. Temples received imperial patronage. Priests served as both religious and administrative authorities, and rituals reinforced the idea that the empire's expansion was divinely ordained. War was holy, victory was sacred, defeat a sign of divine displeasure. The military was the backbone of the civilization's dominance. Its armies were not seasonal militias, but standing forces trained for prolonged campaigns. Soldiers were equipped with standardized weapons and armor, organized under experienced commanders who answered directly to the emperor. Siege warfare reached new levels of sophistication. Psychological warfare was employed to terrify enemies into surrender before battle even began. Rebellion was met with swift and overwhelming force, serving as a warning to all who might challenge imperial authority. Yet for all its power, the civilization was not built solely on fear. Trade flourished under imperial stability. Merchants traveled safely across vast distances, exchanging goods, ideas, and technologies. Agricultural production increased through improved irrigation and state oversight. Cities grew larger, more complex, more interconnected. For many under its rule, life became more predictable, if not always more free. Order replaced chaos. Stability replaced endless local wars. At its height, the empire stood unrivaled. No neighboring power could match its reach or organization. Its rulers adopted grand titles, proclaiming themselves kings of the four quarters of the world, masters of all lands beneath the sun. Their monuments celebrated conquest and divine favor, carved in stone and clay to last forever. It seemed inconceivable that such a civilization could ever be forgotten. But history is rarely kind to empires that grow too quickly. Beneath the surface of imperial strength, cracks began to form. The vastness that made the empire powerful also made it fragile. Distant provinces strained under heavy taxation. Local elites resented foreign administrators. Maintaining a standing army required enormous resources, and every new conquest added fresh borders to defend. Communication, though advanced for its time, was still slow. By the time news of rebellion reached the capital, entire regions could already be lost. Environmental pressures added to the strain. Changes in climate disrupted agriculture, leading to famine and unrest. Drought weakened the river systems that sustained the heartland. As harvests failed, loyalty faltered. The gods who had once blessed expansion now seemed silent. Omens were interpreted as warnings. Confidence gave way to anxiety. Then came the external threats. Peoples from the mountains and deserts, once held at bay by imperial might, sensed weakness. Raids became invasions. Trade routes were disrupted. Cities that had long relied on imperial protection found themselves exposed. The empire responded as it always had, with force, but the results were no longer decisive. Victories were costly. Defeats became more frequent. Internal conflict followed. Succession disputes weakened central authority. Provincial governors grew increasingly independent. The unity that had defined the empire began to unravel. Regions broke away, reviving old identities and rivalries. What had once been a single, dominant power fractured into competing states, each claiming legitimacy, none able to restore the former glory. The collapse, when it came, was swift. Within a few decades, the empire that had dominated the ancient world ceased to exist. Its capital was abandoned or destroyed. Its administrative system fell apart. Its royal line ended. New powers rose in its place, adopting some of its innovations while erasing its memory. History moved on. And then, astonishingly, the civilization was forgotten.
Later peoples lived among its ruins without knowing who had built them. Myths replaced history. Its achievements were attributed to legendary figures or lost races. Its language survived, but its speakers did not. Even its name disappeared from common knowledge. For thousands of years, the first empire lay silent beneath the earth, its story untold. Civilization was built. Its legacy is everywhere, even if its name is rarely spoken. In the idea of centralized government, in the concept of empire, in law, administration, language, and war, the ancient world was shaped by its dominance, and the modern world still echoes with its influence. This is the story of a civilization that ruled the known world, then vanished into the dust of time. A reminder that even the greatest powers are temporary, that dominance does not guarantee memory, and that history, no matter how deeply buried, always waits to be rediscovered. As the forgotten empire faded from living memory, its lands did not fall into emptiness. Instead, new peoples moved into its cities, fields, and temples, unknowingly inheriting the skeleton of a civilization that had once ruled them all. Walls were repaired, canals reused, palaces repurposed. Yet the identity of the builders was lost. The empire became a ghost, present everywhere but named nowhere. Generations passed, and stories began to change. Where history once spoke of kings, later legends spoke of gods and giants. Massive stone foundations were said to be the work of divine beings or heroes from an age beyond time. Broken statues were worshipped as relics of mythical ancestors. The memory of real rulers, real battles, and real empires dissolved into folklore, carried by oral tradition but stripped of truth. Meanwhile, successor civilizations borrowed heavily from the forgotten empire, often without realizing it. They adopted its systems of administration, copied its legal traditions, and imitated its royal titles. Even its calendar and methods of record-keeping survived in altered forms. These later societies believed themselves innovators, yet much of what they built rested upon foundations laid centuries earlier by hands long turned to dust. The language of the lost empire continued to exert quiet dominance. Though no longer spoken in daily life, it became the tongue of scholarship, diplomacy, and religion. Priests chanted in it. Scholars recorded omens and celestial movements with its symbols. Kings issued proclamations using its script to appear ancient, legitimate, and divinely favored. The language became sacred, frozen in time, detached from the people who had once spoken it freely in markets and homes. This linguistic survival created an illusion. Later historians believed the civilization had always been marginal, a background culture rather than a dominant power. Because its language endured while its political memory vanished, its true scale was misunderstood. Only fragments remained, scattered references that made little sense without context. The empire's story lay broken, waiting to be reassembled. The cities themselves told a similar tale. Once thriving urban centers slowly declined as trade routes shifted and political power moved elsewhere. Populations shrank. Buildings crumbled. Floods buried streets in silt. Wind carried sand into abandoned halls. Over time, entire cities disappeared beneath the earth, preserved not by stone, but by silence. Centuries later, travelers crossed these lands and reported strange mounds rising from flat plains. Locals avoided them, calling them cursed or sacred. No one dared dig too deeply. The ground was thought to belong to spirits of the past. And so the empire slept, undisturbed, its records sealed in hardened clay, its monuments broken but intact beneath layers of soil. The rediscovery began slowly, almost accidentally. Early explorers searching for biblical cities, legendary capitals, or ancient wonders stumbled upon fragments that did not fit known histories. Strange symbols appeared on bricks and tablets. Ruins emerged that were older than any civilization recorded in classical texts. Scholars were puzzled. Something vast had existed here, something unaccounted for. At first, the world resisted the idea. How could such a powerful civilization have been forgotten entirely? How could Greek and Roman writers, so meticulous in recording history, have overlooked an empire of this magnitude? The answer was uncomfortable. History itself had gaps. Written memory was fragile. What was not continuously retold could vanish, no matter how great. As excavations expanded, the scale of the forgotten empire became undeniable. City after city emerged from the ground. Administrative archives revealed complex governance. Royal inscriptions described conquests spanning continents. Suddenly, a civilization once reduced to myth stood revealed as the architect of imperial rule. The decipherment of its language marked a turning point. When scholars finally unlocked the meaning of the symbols pressed into clay thousands of years earlier, the empire found its voice again. Kings spoke across millennia. Soldiers described campaigns. Officials recorded rations. Mothers wrote letters to sons at war. For the first time in human history, an entire lost civilization spoke directly to the modern world. What emerged was not merely a tale of conquest, but of humanity. The empire was ruthless, yet sophisticated, violent, yet visionary. It created systems that allowed millions to live under a single political order for the first time. It struggled with the same problems modern societies face: inequality, rebellion, environmental stress, and the burden of maintaining power. Its rulers believed they had achieved immortality through monuments and inscriptions. In a sense, they were right, but not in the way they imagined. Their names were forgotten, but their ideas survived. Every later empire echoed their innovations. Every centralized state carried traces of their administrative logic. Even modern concepts of governance owe a debt to this ancient power. Yet the story also serves as a warning. The empire's fall was not caused by a single enemy or disaster. It collapsed through accumulation, too much expansion, too much strain, too much confidence in permanence. It believed itself eternal. History proved otherwise. The forgotten civilization reminds us that dominance does not equal legacy, and power does not guarantee remembrance. Memory must be preserved, retold, and protected, or it will fade. Empires rise believing they are unique, but they fall like all before them, leaving behind ruins and questions. Today, the lands of this ancient empire are still inhabited. Modern cities rise near ancient mounds. Roads follow paths laid thousands of years ago. Rivers still flow through canals first cut by imperial engineers. The past is not gone. It lies beneath our feet, shaping the present in ways we rarely notice. This is not just the story of one civilization. It is the story of human ambition, creativity, and fragility. A story repeated across ages, in different forms, under different names. The first empire may have been forgotten, but its shadow stretches across all of history. And as long as humans seek power, unity, and control, the echoes of this lost civilization will continue to speak, quietly, persistently, reminding us that even the greatest dominance can vanish, and even the deepest silence can one day be broken.
To truly understand how this forgotten civilization dominated the ancient world, we must step inside its daily life, beyond the grand monuments and royal inscriptions, and into the rhythm of ordinary existence. Power was not sustained by kings alone, but by farmers who worked the fields, scribes who shaped words into permanence, merchants who connected distant lands, and soldiers who carried the weight of empire on their backs. At dawn, cities stir with activity. Markets fill with voices speaking the imperial tongue, mixed with accents from distant provinces. Grain from fertile plains, metals from mountain regions, timber from far forests, and luxury goods from lands beyond the empire's borders all flowed into urban centers. Trade was not merely tolerated. It was encouraged, regulated, and taxed. The state understood that wealth strengthened power, and power protected wealth. Farmers formed the backbone of the civilization. Their labor fed armies, officials, and cities. Vast irrigation networks turned unpredictable rivers into reliable lifelines. Canals were maintained under state supervision, and water distribution was carefully controlled. A good harvest meant stability. A failed one meant unrest. The empire rose and fell with the rhythm of the land, even as it pretended to rule above nature itself. Scribes occupied a position of immense importance. Literacy was rare, and writing was power. These men were trained for years to master the complex script of the empire, learning to record everything from royal decrees to livestock inventories. They were the memory of the state. Through their tablets, the empire tracked resources, enforced laws, and preserved history. Without them, centralized rule would have been impossible. Law was another pillar of domination. Justice was not left to local customs alone. Imperial law codes standardized punishments, property rights, and obligations. While harsh by modern standards, these laws brought predictability to a diverse population. People knew what was expected of them and what the consequences would be if they defied authority. Order, not fairness, was the goal. Religion shaped every aspect of life. Festivals marked agricultural cycles and military victories alike. Temples served as spiritual centers and economic hubs, storing grain, employing workers, and lending resources. The gods were believed to actively intervene in human affairs, rewarding loyalty and punishing disobedience. Priests interpreted omens, advised rulers, and reinforced the idea that the empire existed by divine will. Children grew up surrounded by symbols of power. Statues of kings loomed over city gates. Victory reliefs depicted defeated enemies kneeling before imperial rulers. Stories passed down through families celebrated conquest and obedience. From a young age, people learned that the empire was not just a political entity. It was the natural order of the world. Military service was both feared and honored. Young men were conscripted or volunteered, trained to march, fight, and endure long campaigns far from home. The army was a melting pot of cultures, uniting soldiers from many regions under a single banner. Loyalty to the emperor superseded local identity. Victory brought rewards. Defeat brought shame, or worse. Yet beneath the structure lay constant tension. Not all accepted imperial rule willingly. Some regions rebelled again and again, refusing to surrender their autonomy. These uprisings were crushed with brutal efficiency, their leaders executed, their cities destroyed or depopulated. Such acts were recorded proudly, meant to deter future resistance. Fear was a tool, and it was used without hesitation. Despite this, the empire was not static. It evolved. New technologies were adopted, administrative methods refined. Cultural exchange enriched art, music, and literature. The civilization absorbed influences from conquered peoples, blending them into its own identity. This adaptability fueled its longevity, allowing it to dominate for centuries rather than decades. But adaptability had limits. As time passed, the distance between ruler and subject grew wider. The imperial court became increasingly removed from the realities of provincial life. Decisions were made based on reports, not experience. Corruption seeped into administration. Officials exploited their power. Trust eroded. The idea of empire remained strong, but its execution weakened. The military, once unstoppable, became overextended. Soldiers were sent to defend borders thousands of miles apart. Garrisons were stretched thin. Veterans were settled on lands that could no longer support them. Loyalty began to shift from the state to local commanders. The seeds of fragmentation were sown within the very institution that had built the empire. At the same time, rival powers learned from the empire's example. They adopted similar military tactics, administrative systems, and diplomatic strategies. What had once been unique became common. The empire's greatest innovation, imperial rule, was no longer its exclusive advantage. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, dominance turned into vulnerability. When collapse finally arrived, it did not feel like the end of the world. There was no single moment of destruction. Life went on. Farmers still planted crops. Merchants still traded. But the certainty was gone. Authority fractured. Protection vanished. The empire faded not with a roar, but with a whisper, and then silence. Centuries later, when scholars pieced together fragments of the civilization, they realized something extraordinary. The ancient world as we know it could not be understood without this forgotten empire. It was a bridge between early city-states and later global powers. It was a prototype from which all empires borrowed. Its story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. History is selective. What survives is not always what mattered most. Entire civilizations can disappear if no one remains to remember them. Yet memory has a way of returning. Through ruins, inscriptions, and rediscovered voices, this lost civilization has reemerged, reclaiming its place as one of humanity's greatest achievements and greatest warnings. It reminds us that power is temporary, but influence can be eternal. That dominance can vanish, but ideas endure. And as we continue to uncover the past, layer by layer, one question remains. How many other civilizations once ruled the world, only to be forgotten, still waiting beneath the earth for their stories to be told? At the center of this forgotten civilization stood its rulers, figures both feared and revered, whose decisions shaped the fate of millions. These were not kings in the later Romantic sense, but absolute monarchs whose authority was woven into every aspect of life. Their words carried the weight of law. Their victories were celebrated as divine triumphs, and their failures were hidden, reinterpreted, or blamed on the will of the gods. Each ruler inherited more than a throne. He inherited an ideology, the belief that the empire was a natural ruler of the world, and that expansion was not aggression, but destiny. From the moment a king ascended the throne, he was expected to prove his worth through conquest. Peace was not a sign of stability. It was a sign of weakness. A king who did not expand the empire risked rebellion, loss of legitimacy, and the wrath of the gods. Royal courts were places of ceremony and calculation. Advisors, generals, priests, and scribes competed for influence. Behind polished rituals lay constant intrigue. Loyalty was rewarded generously, but betrayal was punished without mercy. Assassinations, coups, and forced successions were not rare. They were part of the system. Power was too great, and the stakes too high, for smooth transitions to be guaranteed. War was the primary language of politics. Campaigns were carefully planned to coincide with agricultural cycles, ensuring armies could be supplied without crippling the economy. Before marching, Rulers consulted omens, inspected sacrifices, and sought divine approval. Victory confirmed their right to rule. Defeat threatened not only their reign, but the cosmic order they claimed to uphold. The empire's wars were relentless. Year after year, armies marched into neighboring lands. Cities were besieged. Populations were deported. Entire regions were reshaped to serve imperial needs. Conquered peoples were often relocated, breaking old loyalties and spreading skilled labor throughout the empire. Resistance was remembered, recorded, and punished across generations. Yet, conquest was not solely destructive. It brought exchange. Ideas, technologies, and beliefs flowed along the same routes as armies. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature advanced through contact with diverse cultures. The empire became a vast laboratory of human interaction, blending knowledge from across the ancient world. Still, the burden of endless war weighed heavily. Soldiers spent years away from home. Resources were drained. Victories grew harder to achieve. Enemies adapted. Borders became unstable. Each new ruler inherited a larger, more fragile realm than the last. Within the court, paranoia intensified. Kings increasingly relied on propaganda to project strength. Inscriptions exaggerated victories and omitted defeats. Monuments celebrated triumphs that barely held the empire together. History was carefully curated to maintain the illusion of invincibility. Succession became a critical weakness. With no clear system to determine the next ruler, power struggles erupted after each death. Brothers fought brothers. Sons were overthrown by uncles. Civil wars drained the empire from within, leaving borders exposed and provinces restless. As central authority weakened, provincial leaders gained power. Once loyal administrators became semi-independent rulers. Taxes were withheld. Armies answered to local commanders rather than the throne. The idea of empire persisted, but the reality fractured. External enemies seized the moment. Long subdued, peoples rose in revolt. New coalitions formed. Invasions came not as raids, but as coordinated campaigns. Cities fell that had once been unassailable. The empire fought back, but its responses were slower, less decisive. The final centuries were marked by desperation. Kings promised reforms but delivered repression. Religious rituals intensified as rulers sought divine favor. Omens were interpreted obsessively. Fear replaced confidence. The belief in eternal dominance crumbled. When the last great capital fell, it was not the end of civilization in the region, but it was the end of an idea. The first true empire was gone. What remained were fragments, broken cities, scattered peoples, and a legacy misunderstood by those who inherited it. And then history moved on. Later empires rose, claiming to be unprecedented, unaware that they followed a path already walked. They repeated the same patterns: expansion, consolidation, overreach, collapse. The forgotten civilization became a silent teacher, its lessons ignored because its name was lost. Today, as we study its remains, we see not just ruins, but reflections of ourselves. The same ambitions, the same fears, the same belief that power can last forever. The civilization that once dominated the ancient world was not erased by time alone. It was buried by the illusion of permanence. Its story reminds us that no empire is immune to decay, and no dominance is truly eternal. The final collapse of the forgotten civilization did not arrive as a single catastrophic moment, but as a slow unraveling that stretched across generations. By the time later chroniclers might have noticed something was wrong, the empire was already hollow. Its symbols still stood, its rituals still performed, its king still crowned, but the strength that once animated them was gone. Cities that had once thrived under imperial protection now fortified themselves independently. Merchants avoided long-distance routes, fearing raids and instability. Farmers abandoned fields that could no longer be defended or irrigated. The economy, once tightly managed by the state, fractured into local systems. What had been an interconnected imperial world dissolved into isolated regions, each struggling to survive. The capital itself became a shadow of its former glory. Palaces that once hosted ambassadors from distant lands echoed with fewer voices. Royal ceremonies grew more elaborate, perhaps to compensate for diminishing authority. The rulers clung to tradition, believing that if the old forms were preserved, the old power might return. It did not. As central control weakened, writing declined. Scribes were no longer trained in the same numbers. Archives were neglected or destroyed. With fewer records being kept, memory itself began to fail. Laws once enforced across the empire became meaningless beyond city walls. History slipped into silence. Invasions accelerated the collapse. What had once been manageable threats now struck deep into imperial territory. Cities fell not because they lacked walls, but because they lacked unity. Defenders fought bravely, but without coordination or reinforcement. Resistance was temporary. One by one, the great urban centers were abandoned or destroyed. The population scattered. Some fled to the countryside. Others merged with invading peoples. Identities blurred. The imperial language, once dominant, became fragmented, preserved only in religious or scholarly contexts. Everyday speech changed. Within a few generations, children no longer knew the names of the kings who had ruled their grandparents. The gods, too, began to fade. Temples were repurposed or neglected. Rituals lost their meaning as faith in divine protection weakened. New beliefs emerged, offering hope in a world no longer held together by imperial order. Religion shifted from supporting the state to comforting individuals. What followed was not immediate darkness, but transformation. Smaller kingdoms rose in the ruins of empire. Some claimed descent from the old rulers. Others rejected the imperial past entirely. None could recreate the vast unity that had once existed. The age of empire had ended, for now. Over centuries, the memory of the civilization dissolved completely. Classical historians mention fragments, often misunderstood or distorted. Myths replaced facts. The empire became a footnote, then a rumor, then nothing at all. The greatest power the ancient world had ever known vanished from human awareness. And yet, it never truly disappeared. Its influence persisted in quiet ways. Road networks continued to guide travel. Administrative divisions shaped later borders. Legal concepts echoed through subsequent law codes. Even the idea that the world could be ruled as a single political entity survived, inspiring future conquerors and empires. When modern archaeologists uncovered the remains, they were stunned not only by the scale, but by the familiarity. Here were the roots of governance, warfare, and bureaucracy as we know them. Here was the origin of empire itself. The forgotten civilization forces us to rethink history. It reminds us that what we remember is shaped by chance, preservation, and power. That greatness can be erased if no one is left to tell the story. That silence does not mean absence. It means waiting. Today, its ruins lie beneath modern cities and open plains, quietly enduring. Clay tablets rest in museums, their words finally heard again. The empire speaks once more, not through conquest, but through understanding. This was a civilization that dominated the ancient world, then was forgotten, and its story is not just ancient history. It is a mirror held up to every civilization that believes itself eternal. Even after its political collapse and long descent into obscurity, the forgotten civilization continued to shape the world in ways almost no one recognized. Its most enduring legacy was not its kings or its conquests, but the invisible frameworks it left behind, structures of thought that future societies would adopt without ever knowing their origin. The very idea of a centralized state, ruled from a single capital and enforced through law, taxation, and bureaucracy, was perfected by this ancient power. Later civilizations refined it, softened it, or brutalized it further, but the blueprint remained the same. Officials reporting upward, resources flowing inward, authority radiating outward. This model of governance became the default for empires that followed, from antiquity to the modern age. The empire's approach to record-keeping quietly revolutionized history itself. By documenting everything, from royal triumphs to daily rations, it created a culture of written memory. Even when its own records were lost, the habit of documentation survived. Later societies continued to write, count, archive, and analyze, carrying forward a legacy of literacy as governance. Its military doctrines endured as well. Discipline, logistics, and psychological warfare became standard tools of conquest. The understanding that wars are won not just on the battlefield, but through supply chains, morale, and administration was one of the empire's greatest insights. Future generals would rediscover these principles again and again, believing them new. Culturally, the empire demonstrated how domination could coexist with absorption. Rather than erasing conquered peoples entirely, it integrated them, adopting their gods, art styles, technologies, and knowledge. This created a rich, hybrid civilization and set a precedent for cultural exchange within imperial systems. Empires that follow would struggle with this balance, often repeating the same successes and failures. The forgotten civilization also left behind a philosophical legacy. Its rulers believed order was fragile, constantly threatened by chaos. This worldview justified strict laws, harsh punishments, and relentless expansion. Stability, they believed, could only be maintained through strength. This idea would echo through history, shaping political thought far beyond the ancient world. Yet its story also carries a counter lesson. The same systems that enabled dominance ultimately contributed to collapse. Over-centralization bred rigidity. Expansion created vulnerability. Control demanded resources that eventually ran out. The empire's downfall became a case study in the limits of power, even if no one remembered the original example. Modern scholars, piecing together fragments of the civilization, began to see history differently. The ancient world was no longer a simple progression from primitive to advanced. Instead, it was cyclical, experiments in power rising, falling, and being reinvented. The forgotten empire was not an anomaly, but the first iteration of a pattern repeated endlessly. Its rediscovery challenged long-held assumptions. It revealed that human societies had achieved extraordinary complexity far earlier than once believed. It forced historians to confront how much had been lost, not through destruction alone, but through neglect and forgetting. The empire's story resonates today because it feels familiar. We recognize the confidence of its rulers, the ambition of its expansions, the anxiety beneath its rituals. We see ourselves in their belief that systems can endure indefinitely, that technology and organization can overcome all limits. But the ruins tell a different story. They remind us that civilizations are agreements, not guarantees. That memory requires preservation. That power without adaptability decays. The forgotten civilization did not fail because it lacked intelligence or strength. It failed because it believed its own permanence. In the end, what makes the civilization remarkable is not just that it dominated the ancient world, but that it disappeared so completely. Its absence became part of its lesson. It stands as proof that history is not written by the strongest alone, but by those whose stories survive. As more tablets are translated and more ruins uncovered, the empire continues to speak. Each discovery adds depth, complexity, and humanity to a civilization once reduced to silence. The past grows louder, not quieter. And perhaps that is the final irony. The civilization that once ruled through command and conquest is remembered today through patience, curiosity, and listening. Its dominance has ended, but its influence endures, woven into the fabric of human history, invisible but undeniable. This is not the end of the story, but the widening of it. Because as long as humans build systems of power, they will echo the forgotten empire, whether they know it or not. As the story draws toward its end, what remains is not a single civilization, but a question that echoes across all of human history. How could a society so powerful, so influential, and so advanced vanish almost entirely from memory? And what does that silence reveal about us? The forgotten civilization teaches us that history is not a straight line of progress. It is a fragile chain of remembrance. When records are lost, languages fade, and traditions break, even the greatest achievements can disappear. Monuments crumble, names vanish. What survives is not always what mattered most, but what happened to be preserved, retold, and rediscovered. For centuries, the ancient world was understood through the lens of later civilizations that inherited power, literacy, and influence. Their stories became history. The forgotten empire, lacking heirs who claimed its legacy, slipped through the cracks of memory. Its voice was buried, not because it was weak, but because no one remained to speak for it. And yet, its influence never truly ended. Every empire that rose afterward, whether in the ancient Mediterranean, Asia, Africa, or beyond, reflected the same fundamental ideas first tested by the civilization: central authority, written law, standing armies, taxation, propaganda, the belief that order must be imposed to survive. These were not isolated inventions. They were echoes. Even in the modern world, these patterns persist. Governments still rely on bureaucracy to function. Militaries still depend on logistics as much as force. Leaders still invoke destiny, security, or divine favor to justify expansion and control. The tools have changed, but the logic remains hauntingly familiar. The ruins of forgotten civilizations stand as a quiet warning. They tell us that no system, no matter how sophisticated, is immune to collapse. That complexity can become fragility. That dominance can blind societies to their own limits. And that believing in permanence is often the first step toward decline. Yet there is also hope in this story. The rediscovery of this lost empire proves that silence is not the same as erasure. The past can return. Knowledge can be recovered. Voices can speak again, even after thousands of years. Through archaeology, scholarship, and curiosity, humanity has learned to listen to the earth itself, to read what time tried to hide. In doing so, we have reclaimed more than history. We have reclaimed perspective. The forgotten civilization reminds us that we are not as unique as we often believe. Our struggles with power, identity, and survival are ancient. Others faced them before us, solved them imperfectly, and paid the price. Their successes and failures are not distant. They are reflections. As long as humans build, govern, conquer, and dream, the story of the civilization will remain relevant. It is not just a tale of the ancient world. It is a timeless narrative about ambition, memory, and the cost of believing oneself eternal. And so, as the dust settles and the voice of this long-lost empire fades once more into silence, one truth remains clear. Civilizations do not truly die when their cities fall. They die when they are forgotten. This was a civilization that dominated the ancient world, then was forgotten, and now remembered again.